It was a normal afternoon when Sarah, the wife of retired Captain James Carter, decided to stop by the local grocery store to pick up a few things. Little did she know, this simple errand would turn into a nightmare, setting off a chain of events that would not only put her freedom at risk but also expose deep-seated racism within the very people sworn to protect and serve. Sarah had always felt safe in her small town, a place where her family had lived for years. Her husband, Captain Carter, was a well-respected figure, having served his country with honor and dedication for over 2 decades. But today, none of that would matter. As Sarah walked out of the store, arms full of groceries, she noticed a police car parked nearby. No big deal, she thought. It was just another routine patrol. But the moment she stepped off the curb, things took a terrifying turn. Out of nowhere, a pair of officers approached her, their faces hard, their voices commanding. "Ma'am, step aside," one of them barked. At first, Sarah thought it might be a misunderstanding. She was, after all, just a woman carrying bags, minding her own business. But the officer's tone grew colder, their eyes more intense. They didn't give her a chance to speak, only demanding she produce identification. "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah asked, confusion and concern creeping into her voice. The officers didn't answer, their eyes scanning her up and down like she was some kind of criminal. They didn't believe her, didn't care about her explanation. Within moments, one of them grabbed her arm and started to pull her toward the police car. It was as if everything in the world stopped. Sarah couldn't believe what was happening. She was being arrested, and she had no idea why. The officers, however, weren't interested in explaining anything to her. They just continued their forceful grip on her, ignoring her cries for clarity. What they didn't know, however, was that Sarah wasn't just any ordinary woman. She was the wife of a decorated war hero, a retired captain who had spent years fighting for this country. And though they didn't know it yet, Sarah's arrest would set in motion a series of events no one could have predicted. As the officers shoved her into the back of the patrol car, a crowd began to gather. Some people stood back, shocked by the scene unfolding before them. Others whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or just watch. But none of them stepped forward to help, and soon, the car was speeding away, leaving the shocked onlookers behind. Meanwhile, Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even raised her voice. All she wanted was to go home to her husband. Back at their home, Captain Carter was just finishing his lunch when he received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, panicked. It was Sarah. "James, they've arrested me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know why. The cops, they won't tell me anything. I'm scared." The words hit Captain Carter like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His first instinct was to rush out the door, to protect his wife from whatever was happening. But he knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. He grabbed his coat and was out the door in seconds, heading toward the local police station. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to let this injustice slide. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. The police station was buzzing with activity, but the officers didn't seem concerned about the commotion surrounding Sarah's arrest. They acted as if it were just another day, another routine call. The captain demanded to see his wife, but the officers refused. They told him she was being processed, that there was nothing he could do. They wouldn't give him any information, wouldn't answer his questions. All he could do was wait. Inside, Sarah sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, her heart pounding. She had never felt so alone in her life. The officers, still silent and stoic, watched her every move. Sarah had never felt the weight of discrimination so heavily. She was a black woman, but more than that, she was a person, a wife, a mother, a daughter. None of those things mattered to these officers. They saw her only through the lens of their biases, their preconceptions, their assumptions about who she was. As the hours ticked by, Sarah couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't just a case of a misunderstanding. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. And just as she was about to speak up, to demand answers, the door to the interrogation room opened. But it wasn't an officer standing there. It was Captain Carter, his face stern and determined. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief as she rushed into his arms. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: her husband was here, and together, they would find out what was really going on. What happened after that was a complete shock. The truth behind Sarah's arrest would be uncovered, revealing a chain of corruption, racism, and power that nobody could have predicted. The officers who had wrongfully detained her would soon regret underestimating the captain's determination, and the consequences would be far-reaching. But before that happened, Sarah and Captain Carter would have to navigate a storm of lies, intimidation, and personal betrayal that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about justice. And that's where the story truly begins. What happens next? How will they fight back against a system that's supposed to protect them but instead has failed them? Stay tuned for the shocking twist that no one saw coming. As Captain Carter stood there, holding his wife tightly in his arms, a flood of emotions surged through him. Relief, fear, anger, each one crashing over him like a wave. He had no idea what kind of storm they were walking into, but one thing was clear: he wasn't about to let it break them. The police officers had no idea who they were dealing with. James Carter had spent his life fighting for the greater good, not just as a soldier but as a man of honor and integrity. And now, this was his fight. He helped Sarah to her feet, his protective instincts kicking in. She was shaken, her eyes red from tears, but there was a fire in her that made him believe she was stronger than this moment. "We're going to get through this," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But his words were empty. They both knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The reality of their situation was grim, and they were only at the beginning of a much larger battle. They were led to a small room where they were told to wait. The officers still refused to give them any details about the arrest, only muttering vague responses about standard procedures. James didn't trust them. Not one bit. He kept his eyes on the door, waiting for the moment when someone would finally give them answers. He needed to know what had really happened, why his wife had been treated like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Minutes turned into hours, but no one came to speak with them. It was as if they were being purposely ignored. Every now and then, James would ask about Sarah's status, but he was met with nothing but cold indifference. The tension in the room was unbearable, and the silence only deepened the mystery. It didn't make sense. Sarah wasn't a criminal. She wasn't even someone who would cause a scene. So why had they targeted her? James had seen enough injustice during his time in the military to know when something wasn't right. His mind began to race. Was this a case of mistaken identity? Or was there something deeper at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an unfortunate situation, it felt personal. And as he thought about it more, one horrifying possibility began to take shape. What if this had been about race? Sarah, of course, had considered that possibility from the moment the officers had started treating her like a suspect. She had seen how people in her community, good, hard-working people who were trying to go about their lives, had been pulled over, harassed, and sometimes even detained by the police for no reason other than the color of their skin. She knew the stories. And though it had never happened to her before, something told her this was exactly what was going on. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the chilling truth: the officers had seen her black skin and assumed she didn't belong. That was the only explanation that made sense. And that hurt. It hurt more than she cared to admit. The hours dragged on, and still no one came to speak with them. James was growing more impatient by the second. He had served his country, had dedicated his life to protecting the freedoms of others, and now, he was sitting in a police station, waiting for answers. It felt like an insult. A betrayal of everything he had fought for. And it made him even more determined to fight back. Finally, as the sun began to set, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was Officer Stevens, the one who had led the arrest. He walked into the room with a look of indifference, as if nothing had happened. His presence sent a wave of anger through James's chest, but he kept his cool. He had to. For Sarah. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Stevens said flatly, glancing briefly at both of them before sitting down across from them. I understand this has been frustrating, but we are following procedure. Your wife will be released soon, and will be conducting an internal investigation into the matter. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Internal investigation? That was it. They were just going to sweep it under the rug, act like it was no big deal? It was maddening. An investigation? James repeated, his voice barely controlled. What do you mean by that? What exactly happened here? Why was my wife arrested? She wasn't doing anything wrong. Stevens hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under James's piercing gaze. It's complicated. We received a report that matched a description of someone involved in a theft, and your wife fit that description. That's all I can tell you at this time. A theft? James felt his heart sink. A theft? He looked at his wife, who had gone pale, her face a mixture of disbelief and hurt. They had been living in this town for years, and Sarah had always been nothing but a model citizen. The thought of her being involved in any kind of crime was absurd. But the officer's words hung in the air, and James couldn't help but wonder if this was just an excuse. An excuse to justify what had really happened, an officer's prejudice, their need to assert control over someone they saw as other. Before he could respond, Officer Stevens stood up, his posture stiff. I'll have someone explain everything to you once the investigation is complete. But for now, you'll have to wait. He didn't wait for a response, simply turning and walking out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice quiet but filled with disbelief. Do you think it was about race? She asked softly, her eyes searching James's face for an answer. James didn't have an answer, not yet. But his gut told him she was right. He had seen it before, in the eyes of certain officers, in the way they looked at people who didn't look like them. The suspicion, the fear, the condescension, it was all too familiar. He stood up, his mind made up. We're not going to let this go, Sarah. They think they can get away with this, but we're going to make sure they don't. We'll find out the truth. We'll expose what happened here. Sarah nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. She didn't know how to feel. All she knew was that something had been taken from her today, something precious, her dignity, her sense of safety. And she wasn't sure how to get it back. But James was determined. This wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about exposing the ugly truths that had been hidden for too long. It was about standing up to a system that had allowed racism to fester unchecked. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. They left the station later that evening, but the battle was just beginning. What happened next would test everything they believed in. They had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, they would never stop fighting for what was right. And that fight would take them places they never expected to go. The truth was out there, and they were going to find it. As James and Sarah left the police station, the weight of the day's events still hung heavy in the air. They didn't speak much as they drove home, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The quiet in the car was deafening. James had always been a man of action, someone who prided himself on taking control of every situation, but tonight, he felt helpless. His wife, the woman he had vowed to protect, had been humiliated, and the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. There had to be more to this than a simple mistake. He glanced at Sarah, who sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. He wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Not yet. The damage had been done, and the hurt was deep. He could feel it in the silence that stretched between them. When they arrived home, James barely had time to get through the front door before he grabbed his phone. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the number of his old friend, Detective Marcus Hayes. Marcus had been one of the few people James trusted during his time in the service. He was smart, reliable, and, most importantly, he understood the importance of fighting for what was right. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. The phone rang twice before Marcus picked up. "Carter? What's going on?" His voice was warm, but James could hear the concern in his tone. "I need your help, Marcus," James said, his voice tense. "Something happened today. My wife was arrested by 2 officers in a completely bogus situation. They're covering something up, and I need to know what it is." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Marcus responded, his voice low. "You're sure it's not just a misunderstanding? You know how these things can get blown out of proportion." "I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't add up," James shot back. "This feels wrong, Marcus." "I don't care what they say, they're hiding something." Marcus sighed. "All right, I'll look into it. But you need to be careful. This could get messy." James didn't need to hear that. He knew it already. But it didn't matter. He wasn't going to let this go. Not when he knew what he knew. As the evening dragged on, James sat in the living room, his mind racing. His thoughts kept circling back to the same thing. The officers had acted like Sarah was guilty of something, when she wasn't. He couldn't help but wonder if they had arrested her for no other reason than the color of her skin. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Meanwhile, Sarah had retreated to their bedroom. She sat by the window, staring out into the night, lost in her own world. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her life. The world that had once felt like a safe place now seemed like a battleground. The police officer's actions had left a mark on her soul that no one could erase. But it wasn't just about what happened at the station, it was about something deeper. Something she had felt for a long time, but had never been able to put into words. The truth was, she had always known the world didn't view her the same way it viewed others. She had always known she was judged differently, treated with suspicion and doubt because of the color of her skin. But today, it wasn't just an invisible prejudice. Today, she had felt it in her bones. She had seen it in the officer's eyes. And it had shaken her to the core. The next day, as they tried to return to some sense of normalcy, things only became more complicated. News of Sarah's arrest began to spread. Whispers started circulating, and soon, everyone in their community seemed to have an opinion on what had happened. Some people were supportive, offering kind words and encouragement. But there were others, the ones who had never been particularly friendly with Sarah and James, who started to turn on them. They painted Sarah as a troublemaker, a woman who had brought this upon herself. The idea that she could be the victim of racial profiling was too hard for some people to accept. James had always known that there were people who held prejudiced views, but now, those views seemed to be coming out of the shadows, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. He could feel the tension rising in the town, a tension that made him uneasy. The more the story spread, the more it became clear, this was no longer just about one woman's wrongful arrest. This was about something much bigger, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for years. As the days passed, Sarah found herself retreating further and further into herself. She didn't want to go out in public, didn't want to face the stares, the whispers, the judgment. James tried to comfort her, but he could see the change in her. The woman who had always been strong and confident was now hesitant, unsure. She had become a symbol of something she never asked to be. A symbol of injustice. One night, as James sat at the kitchen table, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Marcus. He had come bearing news, but it wasn't the kind of news James had been hoping for. "I've been digging into the situation, James," Marcus said, sitting down across from him. "And I've found something. It's not just a random mistake. The officers involved in your wife's arrest? They have a history. A history that suggests they've been involved in similar incidents before. There are whispers about them targeting black individuals, especially those they believe don't fit in." James's stomach tightened. So this wasn't just an isolated incident. They've been doing this for a while. Marcus nodded grimly. Exactly. But it gets worse. I've spoken to some of the other officers in the department. They're afraid to speak out, but it's clear that there's a culture of silence. Nobody wants to rock the boat. And the higher-ups? They're turning a blind eye to it all. The truth is, if this goes public, it could bring the whole department down. They don't want that. James's mind reeled. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about his wife anymore. This was about a system of corruption, racism, and abuse of power that went far beyond the actions of two rogue officers. And if he was going to expose it, he would have to face forces much more powerful than he had ever imagined. The room seemed to close in around him as he processed the weight of what Marcus had just revealed. This was bigger than they had thought. Bigger than anything they could handle alone. And yet, deep down, he knew they had no choice but to keep fighting. The stakes had just been raised. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air long after the detective left. James sat in silence, staring at the empty space across from him where Marcus had been. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the magnitude of the situation became clearer. He had always known there were deep-rooted issues with the system, but this was something far worse than he'd ever anticipated. It wasn't just one officer, or even two. It was a system, an entire network of people who had been using their power to oppress and control, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. James's thoughts raced. The officers involved in Sarah's arrest had a history, a pattern of targeting people who didn't fit their narrow view of who deserved respect. They had seen Sarah, a well-spoken, dignified woman, and decided she was out of place, a threat to their version of the world. And now, they had crossed a line, treating her as if she were no better than a criminal. The worst part? They likely thought they could get away with it. After all, who would believe a black woman over the word of law enforcement? James's grip tightened on the edge of the table. His blood boiled as he thought about how Sarah must have felt in that moment, the fear, the confusion, the helplessness. He had been at the station when it happened, but he had been powerless. His position, his military background, meant nothing in the face of that kind of prejudice. And now, it wasn't just about his wife's wrongful arrest. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. But there was no easy way to bring this to light. James knew that if he pushed too hard, if he made too much noise, the repercussions could be devastating. The department would protect its own, and he would risk losing everything, his reputation, his career, his family's safety. But the alternative was just as painful, staying silent, letting Sarah's dignity be trampled on, letting the injustice continue. And that was something James couldn't live with. Sarah, on the other hand, was struggling to find her own way through the storm. She had been doing everything she could to hold herself together, to keep her sense of normalcy. But each day felt harder than the last. It wasn't just the arrest that had shaken her, it was the realization that the world she thought she knew wasn't as safe as she had believed. The stares, the whispers, the judgment, it all felt like a constant reminder of how little she mattered in the eyes of some people. She hadn't told James yet, but the truth was, she felt like she was slowly losing herself. The fear that had taken root in her heart during the arrest had begun to grow, feeding off every moment of doubt, every glance from a stranger. She could no longer walk down the street without wondering if someone might be judging her, if she might be seen as less than, as a criminal. It had shaken her confidence to its core. And the longer she sat with that feeling, the more she realized that the emotional toll was taking a far greater hit than she had anticipated. It was a feeling of invisibility, of being rendered powerless in the face of an unyielding force. Sarah knew she had to stand strong for James, for their family, but the weight of the world was beginning to crush her spirit. There was only so much one person could take before the fear and the doubt started to erode everything. The next morning, as Sarah sat alone in the living room, she received a call from an unexpected source. It was a local journalist, someone she had met at a charity event years ago. The woman introduced herself and got straight to the point. "Sarah, I've been hearing things about what happened to you, and I think people need to know the truth. I want to help you." At first, Sarah hesitated. The idea of going public, of exposing the entire story to the world, felt like a monumental decision. What if it made things worse? What if the backlash was more than she could handle? But as the conversation went on, something in Sarah stirred, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She realized this was her chance, not just to clear her name, but to take a stand against everything that had been done to her, to expose the truth for all to see. "I'm listening," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. The journalist, whose name was Lisa, offered to meet in person and go over everything. She was no stranger to controversial stories, and she assured Sarah that she had the resources to investigate the police department's involvement thoroughly. Lisa also made it clear that the story could gain traction fast, especially given the community's unrest about the incident. As Sarah agreed to meet with Lisa, James was off investigating on his own. He had reached out to some of his old contacts, hoping to find someone within the department who might be willing to speak out. He knew it would be a challenge. No one in their right mind would risk their job to expose the wrongdoings of their colleagues. But deep down, he felt there had to be someone, a good cop, who was disgusted by what was happening. What he didn't know, however, was that someone had already noticed him. Someone on the inside was quietly watching James's every move. It wasn't long before he received a cryptic message late one night, a text from an anonymous number. "They know what you're doing. Be careful." James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was this? How did they know what he was trying to do? For a moment, he considered ignoring the message, chalking it up to paranoia. But he couldn't. This was too real. Someone within the department was trying to stop him, and he didn't know who. Worse, he didn't know how far they were willing to go. His mind raced as he considered his next steps. He couldn't back down now. But he had to be smart. He had to be strategic. Every move from here on out had to be calculated. His family's safety, Sarah's safety, depended on it. The tension between the Carters and the police department continued to build, each side bracing for an inevitable clash. James was determined to expose the truth, but the more he dug, the more complicated things became. He was walking a tightrope, with no guarantee of what awaited him on the other side. The risk was greater than ever, and with every passing day, he could feel the stakes rising higher. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to stop until he got justice. The truth would come out, whether they liked it or not. As the days passed, the tension only seemed to escalate. James and Sarah were both feeling the weight of the situation in ways they hadn't imagined. James's investigation was taking him deeper into a web of secrecy, and every new piece of information he uncovered seemed to lead to more questions rather than answers. He was no longer just trying to clear Sarah's name, he was unraveling a corrupt system that had been in place for far too long. And with every lead that pointed to the officers involved, the more dangerous things became. The stakes were higher now. He was no longer just a concerned husband, he had become a target. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to keep herself together, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The constant scrutiny, the whispers, the sideways glances, it was wearing her down. The journalist, Lisa, had been in touch regularly, gathering information for the story she was planning to run. Sarah had agreed to go public, but now, the idea of the whole world knowing her story felt overwhelming. What if the backlash was too much? What if the community turned on her completely? What if the people she had once considered allies now saw her as nothing more than a victim seeking attention? But deep down, Sarah knew that going public was her only option. She couldn't let this injustice stand any longer. The moment that pushed everything to the brink came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. James was meeting with one of his old military contacts, someone who had once served alongside him in a special ops unit. The man had reached out, warning James that he had seen something troubling while working on a private security detail for a local corporation. Apparently, a group of officers, including those who had arrested Sarah, had been spotted outside a building known for its high-profile connections. James had been skeptical at first, but the more his contact explained, the more it became clear that the officers were involved in something bigger than a wrongful arrest. They had connections, and those connections could be dangerous. That evening, as James returned home, the sense of unease weighed heavily on him. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He found Sarah sitting on the couch, her eyes tired but determined. She had been on the phone with Lisa earlier, and there was a new sense of urgency in her voice. Lisa had uncovered something that sent a chill through Sarah's bones. One of the officers who had arrested her had a long history of complaints against him, many of them related to racial profiling and excessive force. What was even more troubling was that the officer had been directly involved in several high-profile cases, and despite the numerous allegations against him, he had never faced disciplinary action. It was clear now that there was a deliberate effort to protect these officers, to shield them from any real consequences. Sarah's fingers trembled as she handed James the folder Lisa had sent over, the evidence laid out in black and white. The documents inside confirmed their worst fears. The system was rigged, and it was doing everything it could to protect the officers at all costs. James's stomach churned as he read through the list of complaints, each one more damning than the last. The names of victims, the dates of incidents, and the complete lack of action from the department. It was as if the officers had a free pass to do whatever they wanted, with no fear of repercussions. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous their situation became. The threats against them had escalated. James had started to receive cryptic messages on his phone, warning him to stop digging, to leave things alone. The tone of the messages was unmistakable. This was someone with power, someone who had the ability to make their lives miserable if they didn't back off. And it wasn't just anonymous threats anymore. James had noticed strange cars parked outside their home late at night, and once, he had seen a figure standing in the shadows, watching them. The sense of being hunted was growing more real with each passing day. Despite the danger, James and Sarah knew they couldn't stop. They had come too far, and the truth was too important to ignore. But as they prepared for the next step, meeting with Lisa to finalize the story, things took an even darker turn. The night before the meeting, Sarah received a phone call from Lisa. Her voice was shaky, her words rushed. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this, but you need to be careful. I've been getting threats too. And I think they know about us. The people you're up against, they don't want the story to come out." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had known things were getting tense, but this was something else entirely. They weren't just up against a few corrupt officers, they were going up against a system that had been built to silence anyone who tried to expose the truth. It was bigger than they could have ever imagined. The next morning, the situation went from bad to worse. As James and Sarah left their house to meet with Lisa, they noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and there was no one inside. But James's gut told him that this wasn't just a coincidence. They were being watched. With their hearts pounding, they drove to the meeting location, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, empty except for a few patrons in the back. As James and Sarah sat down at a table, Lisa appeared, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They know," she whispered urgently, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "They're on to us. We can't talk here. We need to move fast." James felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment where everything would come to a head. They had known the risks, but now they were staring down the barrel of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Someone, somewhere, was willing to do whatever it took to keep them from exposing the truth. As Lisa handed Sarah the final draft of the story, her hands trembling, she whispered, "You need to get this out, Sarah. They're not going to stop until they shut you up. But if this story gets out, it could change everything." The finality of the moment hit them all at once. James and Sarah exchanged a look, both knowing what had to be done. But as they prepared to leave, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching in the distance sent a wave of panic through them. Something was coming. They were no longer in control of the situation. The danger had become real. And whatever happened next, they would have to face it head-on. The tension hung thick in the air as they made their way out of the cafe, unaware of what was lurking just around the corner. The endgame was fast approaching, and neither of them knew who, or what, would come for them first. The clock was ticking. As they stepped out of the cafe, the world outside felt colder, darker. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of everything that was happening. James glanced over at Sarah, her face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Her grip tightened on the folder Lisa had handed her, her knuckles white against the paper. They had come this far, but now they had no idea what would happen next. Every move they made felt like a calculated risk, one step closer to either exposing the truth or becoming part of the very system they were fighting against. James's instincts told him to be cautious. The tires he had heard screeching before were getting louder now, echoing in the distance as if they were closing in on them. The city streets, which had felt so familiar and safe just days ago, now seemed like a trap. They weren't just walking down the sidewalk anymore, they were walking a fine line between freedom and danger. The world felt different. The stakes were higher than ever before. As they reached their car, a sudden chill ran down James's spine. He caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing by a dark alley, watching them. It was just a shadow at first, but as the figure shifted slightly, James could make out the silhouette of a man in dark clothing. There was something about him that didn't sit right. His posture was tense, his gaze fixed firmly on them. James's heart raced. He had been followed before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a casual observer. Whoever this was, they were waiting for them to make a move. Sarah noticed the tension in James's body, the way his eyes darted to the figure in the alley. She followed his gaze, but the figure was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. "Do you think it's them?" she whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling. "I don't know," James replied, his eyes scanning the street. "But I don't like it." He ushered Sarah into the car quickly, locking the doors behind them. His hand hovered over the ignition for a moment, but before he could start the engine, the sound of screeching tires returned, closer this time. His instincts kicked in. Someone was coming. Fast. Without a word, James slammed the car into gear, pulling out of the parking lot in a sharp, fast turn. His mind raced. He had to think quickly. They couldn't just head straight home, that would be too predictable. Whoever was following them, whoever was hunting them, would be able to track them down in minutes. They needed to shake them off. He glanced over at Sarah, whose face was pale, her lips tight in fear. "Stay calm," he said, though his voice was anything but steady. "We'll be fine. Just hold on." The engine roared as James took a sharp left turn, speeding down a side street, hoping the winding route would confuse anyone on their tail. Sarah gripped the seat as the car swerved, her heart pounding. She could feel the adrenaline racing through her veins. They had to get away, they couldn't let this be the end. They drove through the city's back roads, weaving between narrow streets and alleyways, but the car behind them seemed to be relentless, staying close, not giving up. James's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind calculating their next move. Every moment felt like it could be their last. If they were caught, everything they had fought for, every piece of evidence they had gathered, would be gone. The system they were trying to expose would crush them, and they'd be silenced for good. Suddenly, James slammed on the brakes, making a sharp turn down a small side street that led into a residential area. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The car behind them was still on their tail. His heart pounded louder in his chest. They couldn't outrun them forever. "James, we have to do something," Sarah cried, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to catch us." "I know," he muttered, his mind working fast. "We need to make them think we're going in a different direction." He glanced around and saw an abandoned warehouse ahead. Without thinking, he veered towards it, driving into the dusty lot behind the building. There was a hidden alley there, one he had used years ago in the military when they needed a quick escape route. He had no idea if it would still be open, but it was their only option. James slammed the car into reverse, backing up quickly into the alley. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. There were only a few moments of silence before the sound of tires screeching behind them reached his ears. They were getting closer. Whoever was following them had realized they had lost them, and now they were on a mission to catch up. With a quick decision, James took a sharp left into the narrow alleyway, hoping it would lead them to the rear exit of the warehouse. The car was barely fitting through the space, and the tires squealed in protest as they slid around the corner. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew they had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. As they reached the end of the alley, James saw the light from the rear exit shining ahead. He could hear the car behind them screeching to a halt, but it was too late. They had made it out. They were in the clear, at least for now. James's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, sweat dripping down his forehead. He didn't know if they had truly escaped or if they were still being hunted. But he knew one thing: they couldn't keep running forever. They had to face whatever was waiting for them. The danger was no longer just a matter of shadows in the distance, it was real, it was closing in, and it was about to take everything from them. The battle wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about surviving the fight that had already begun. As the car slowed, Sarah looked at James, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" James's jaw tightened, his gaze focused on the road ahead. "We keep going. We can't stop until we have everything we need." But the question lingered in the air: how much longer could they run? How much longer before the truth caught up with them? James kept his foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal, the engine growling beneath him as they sped through the dimly lit streets. His mind was working at full speed, trying to stay one step ahead of whoever was following them. Sarah, sitting beside him, had her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, her pulse racing. They hadn't been followed in a few minutes, but the nagging feeling that they weren't out of danger yet kept gnawing at her. She could feel the tension in James's body, and it made her wonder if they were really as safe as he was trying to make it seem. They had barely escaped the danger of the alley, but something in the pit of her stomach told her that escape wasn't going to be so easy. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew they couldn't keep running forever. This wasn't just about hiding anymore, this was a full-on war they had stumbled into. If they were ever going to bring the truth to light, they needed a new strategy, and fast. "James, what are we going to do next?" Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of anxiety and determination. Her eyes flickered back to the rearview mirror. No one was behind them for now, but they both knew that wasn't a guarantee. "We keep moving. We're close. We have to get to the safe house and lay low for a while," James replied, his voice gruff but steady. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, but the weight of the situation was beginning to press down on him. The safe house was their last option, the final place where they could regroup and figure out what their next move would be. But even that felt precarious now. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires pierced the night air, sending a jolt of fear through both of them. James's heart dropped into his stomach as he whipped his head around to see a black SUV speeding toward them. The same vehicle that had been tailing them earlier. But this time, it wasn't just behind them, it was closing in fast, determined to overtake them. Before James could even react, the SUV veered into their lane, blocking their path. His mind raced, and without thinking, he swerved the car hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a collision. His heart pounded as the car jolted back onto the road, and he could hear the roar of the SUV gaining on them once again. They were trapped. "James!" Sarah cried, panic rising in her voice. "What do we do?" James's mind was spinning. He was calculating their next move, trying to stay calm. But in that moment, something else happened, something that neither of them had expected. The black SUV, seemingly in pursuit of them, suddenly swerved sharply off the road, racing up onto the curb and stopping in front of a parked car. It was almost as if they were trying to make it seem like they'd lost their target. But James wasn't fooled. There was something more deliberate about this maneuver, something off. His pulse quickened. "Get down!" James barked. But it was already too late. The SUV's doors flew open in unison, and two men stepped out, both wearing dark sunglasses and black suits, their faces cold and unreadable. They were professionals. James's mind flashed to the military days, the kinds of people who were trained to handle dangerous situations, people who didn't make mistakes. These weren't just random goons. They were after something much bigger than just Sarah's wrongful arrest. Before they could get any closer, James floored the accelerator again, racing down the road with everything he had. The black SUV peeled off, matching their speed, and soon, the chase was on again. The feeling of being hunted was growing more intense. But as James glanced in the rearview mirror, something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. The two men from the SUV had pulled out something, 2 rifles, pointed directly at them. "They're armed!" Sarah gasped, her hand gripping the seat as her mind raced. She looked at James, fear and adrenaline flashing through her eyes. "We can't outrun them now." James's mind was racing faster than his car could go. He knew they couldn't keep running, but he also knew they had no choice. If they stopped, they were dead. He turned the wheel sharply, veering into a narrow alley to the right, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets. But the sound of the SUV's engine revving behind them told him they weren't giving up. For a few fleeting moments, the alley offered some hope of escape, but as they neared the end, they saw a police blockade set up ahead. The officers, guns drawn, were standing in a line, blocking their way. This was no ordinary checkpoint, this was an ambush. And as soon as James saw the badges on the officers' uniforms, a chill ran down his spine. The officers weren't just any law enforcement, they were the same ones involved in Sarah's arrest. The same ones who had been linked to corruption, racial profiling, and covering up their tracks. It was as if they had been waiting for this exact moment, ready to silence them once and for all. "James!" Sarah screamed, her voice filled with panic as they slammed toward the blockade. "What are we going to do?" James's heart was racing, but he refused to give in. "Hold on," he muttered, his eyes scanning the area for any possible escape route. He wasn't going to let them corner them like this. There had to be another way out. Just then, as if the universe had conspired against them, the black SUV pulled up alongside them, blocking their escape. James's mind reeled, the tension building to unbearable heights. He could hear the shouting from the police officers, but their voices were drowned out by the pounding in his ears. They were out of options. They couldn't go forward, they couldn't go back, and they were trapped between two forces determined to take them down. But in that moment, just as everything seemed lost, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the night. A dark figure barreled through the police blockade, driving at full speed, sending the officers scattering in every direction. The vehicle, a black motorcycle, sped past them, leaving the chaos in its wake. And before James could process what had just happened, the motorcycle skidded to a stop in front of their car, blocking their path. The rider removed their helmet, revealing a face neither James nor Sarah expected to see. It was Lisa. Her eyes were wide with urgency as she waved them forward. "Get in. Now." The shock of seeing her was enough to momentarily freeze James's mind, but then his instincts took over. Without a second thought, he threw the car into reverse and backed up, narrowly avoiding the police officers now scrambling to regain control. The motorcycle revved to life again, and Lisa led them down a hidden path behind the chaos. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah gasped, still trying to process everything. Lisa's face was tense, but her voice was steady. "You're not the only ones being watched. You're not the only ones trying to take down these corrupt officers. There's a bigger game going on here. You've just scratched the surface." As they sped down the dark road, a new level of fear settled in. The stakes were higher than they'd ever imagined, and now, there were even more players in the game than they realized. The truth was out there, but how much was too much to handle? Lisa's motorcycle roared ahead, and James followed her, the sound of his car's engine almost drowned out by the wind whipping through the night. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. The truth they had been chasing for so long seemed to be slipping through their fingers, and now they were tangled in something far deeper and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The presence of Lisa, who had once seemed like an ally, now acting with urgency and secrecy, left James feeling more unsettled than ever. Who else was in this game? And what exactly was at stake? Sarah, her face pale, kept glancing out the back window, her fear not yet fully dissipating. Lisa, what's going on? Why are the police involved in this? Why are they after us? Lisa didn't answer immediately. She kept her focus on the road, her jaw clenched tight. After a few moments of silence, she pulled the motorcycle over to the side of the road and stopped. James followed her, parking the car behind her in a small, secluded area. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the wind. "Get out," Lisa said firmly. James and Sarah exchanged a look but obeyed. They both stepped out of the car, instinctively moving closer to each other. The tension in the air was palpable, and the quiet felt like it was amplifying the weight of the situation. Lisa turned to face them, taking off her helmet and shaking her hair loose. She looked like someone who had been carrying a burden for too long, a woman who knew more than she let on, and now it was time to share the truth, whether they were ready for it or not. "There's no easy way to say this," Lisa began, her voice low. "You've been chasing a small piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that goes all the way to the top. The police officers who arrested Sarah. They're just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption, the abuse of power, it's more widespread than you think. And it's tied to people who have a lot of influence." James narrowed his eyes, trying to process the gravity of what she was saying. "What do you mean, tied to people who have a lot of influence? Who are we really dealing with here?" Lisa sighed and shook her head, looking over her shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. "I've been working with some people who are trying to expose this system from the inside. But there are others, much more dangerous people, who have been trying to cover it up. People who don't want the truth getting out. And they're willing to do anything to stop us." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "What does that have to do with us? Why are they after us now?" "We just want justice." Lisa's eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something resembling sympathy in her gaze. "You don't realize it, but you've already become part of something much bigger than yourselves. That footage you've been collecting, the evidence you've gathered, it's more important than you think. It's not just about the wrongful arrest anymore. It's about exposing a network of corruption that's been running under the surface for years. And the people behind it are willing to kill to keep it hidden." The weight of Lisa's words settled over them like a suffocating fog. They had been trying to bring light to Sarah's wrongful arrest, to seek justice for an incident that was supposed to be the end of the story. But now, it felt like they were standing at the edge of something far darker, something far more dangerous. They weren't just dealing with rogue officers anymore, they were up against a network of powerful, untouchable figures who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "So, what do we do now?" James asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "How do we stop them?" Lisa hesitated, then motioned for them to follow her as she began to walk toward a small, nondescript van parked a few yards away. "We need to get to the safe house. I'll explain everything once we're there. But we can't stay here for long. They'll be looking for us. The people I'm working with, they've been tracking their every move. But we've got to act fast before they catch up to us." As they climbed into the van, the urgency in Lisa's movements was palpable. She started the engine and pulled away quickly, the tires squealing as she navigated through the dark streets. Sarah's mind was spinning with the information they had just learned, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of the choices they had to make. Could they truly stop these powerful figures? Was it even possible to take down something so deeply embedded in the system? The van's headlights cut through the darkness, the streetlights flashing by in quick succession. James's gaze was fixed on the road ahead, his mind trying to piece everything together. If what Lisa said was true, then their fight was far from over, it was just beginning. The truth had become a weapon, and now they were in possession of it. But who could they trust? Who could they turn to when everyone seemed to have their own agenda? Lisa turned sharply down another narrow street, the van swerving to avoid a pothole. She glanced at them over her shoulder, her eyes serious. The people behind this, they're not just corrupt officers. They're connected to some very powerful individuals in the government and private sectors. If you keep going down this path, you'll be up against them all. You're not just fighting for justice anymore. You're fighting for survival. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of Lisa's words settled in. It wasn't just about seeking justice for a wronged woman. It was about bringing down a network so powerful, so deeply entrenched, that even the law itself couldn't touch it. They were in over their heads, and yet, they couldn't turn back now. The van rounded a corner, and the city lights started to fade behind them. Lisa was right. They couldn't stay in the city. If they wanted any chance at exposing the truth, they needed to get far away from the eyes that were watching them, eyes that were already looking for them. The safe house was their last hope. But even as the van sped off into the night, a nagging feeling twisted in James's gut. What awaited them at the safe house? And would it be enough to keep them safe from the forces that were closing in on them? The van rumbled through the quiet streets, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Lisa drove with an intense focus, her knuckles gripping the steering wheel so tightly that James could see the veins popping on her hands. Sarah sat silently beside him, her mind still racing to make sense of everything that had just been revealed. She looked out the window, trying to calm herself, but her eyes kept darting back to the rearview mirror, expecting to see the flashing lights of a police car or the silhouette of the black SUV pursuing them. It felt like they were running out of time. But the deeper they got into the night, the more they realized just how much danger they were in. Lisa had promised that the safe house was close, but the longer they drove, the more James questioned whether they were truly safe anywhere. Finally, the van slowed, pulling into a secluded driveway that led up to a modest house hidden in the woods. Lisa parked quickly, cutting the engine. "This is it," she said, looking at them both. "We need to stay here for the night. Tomorrow, we go over everything. I'll show you the files." The people we're dealing with, before she could finish, the sound of approaching tires interrupted her. James froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his breath caught in his throat. The last thing he wanted was to be cornered again. The night had been full of too many close calls, and he wasn't ready for another confrontation. But as he scanned the driveway, something didn't seem right. It wasn't the same black SUV. No, this time, it was a sleek, unmarked sedan, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator hunting its prey. Lisa's face tightened, her eyes narrowed as she reached for the glove compartment and pulled out a handgun. "Get inside," she ordered. "Now." They scrambled out of the van, racing up the porch and through the door. Lisa slammed it shut behind them, bolting it quickly before turning to face James and Sarah. The house was silent except for the sound of their ragged breathing. James's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady himself, glancing nervously out the window. Whoever was coming, they were not here for a casual chat. "Who is it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Lisa's expression was grim. "I don't know. But they're not here to help us." The knock at the door came suddenly, echoing through the house with a cold finality. James exchanged a look with Sarah, both of them understanding the weight of what was happening. It was all happening too fast. This wasn't supposed to be how things ended. The safe house, the one place they thought they could escape to, was now a trap. "Stay quiet," Lisa said, her voice low. "No matter what happens, stay out of sight." She moved cautiously toward the door, peering through a small gap in the curtains. For a long moment, there was silence, then another knock, this one louder, more insistent. The people on the other side weren't waiting anymore. Lisa didn't hesitate. She stepped back from the window and turned to face them, her voice hard. "It's them. The ones who've been tracking us. But there's a catch." James's mind raced. "What catch?" Lisa hesitated, then took a deep breath. "They're not just after you and Sarah. They're here to stop me, too. I didn't expect them to come this soon. But I've been trying to expose them for months. They've been watching every step of the way." The revelation hit James like a punch in the gut. Lisa had been more involved in this fight than they ever knew. But why hadn't she told them the full story? Why keep them in the dark? It didn't matter now, though. They were all in this together, whether they liked it or not. The knock came again, this time accompanied by the sound of someone rattling the doorknob. James's heart skipped a beat. They had no time left. "Get ready," Lisa said quietly, walking toward the back door. "We're going to have to make a run for it. They'll be coming in soon. I'll cover you." The plan was simple: escape. But nothing had been simple in this entire mess, and James wasn't sure he trusted anything anymore. Still, it was their only option. They crept toward the back of the house, moving quickly and silently. But just as they reached the door, the sharp sound of glass shattering echoed from the front. Someone had broken in. "Move!" Lisa hissed, pushing them out the back door and into the yard. They ran through the dark, the ground beneath their feet soft and uneven. The night air was thick with tension as they sprinted through the trees, each step a desperate bid for survival. But then, the unexpected happened. A sudden, blinding light flooded the clearing. The harsh beam cut through the trees, and James barely had time to react before a voice called out to them from the darkness. "Hold it right there." James froze, recognizing the voice instantly. It was the last person he ever expected to hear from in this situation. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. It was Detective Harris. But there was something wrong. Harris wasn't wearing his usual police uniform. Instead, he was in civilian clothes, his expression cold and hard. And, more unsettling, his hand was wrapped around a gun, pointed directly at them. "Don't move," Harris ordered, his voice steady. "You're in way over your heads." James's stomach twisted with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What the hell is going on, Harris? Why are you with them?" Harris didn't flinch, his eyes narrowing. "You're too late. I've been working with them all along. The people you've been running from? They're part of a larger operation, and you're not getting out of this. No one is." The betrayal hit like a storm. James's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. Detective Harris, someone they had trusted, had been part of the conspiracy all along. But even as the truth settled in, something else gnawed at him. Harris didn't seem like the same man they had known. His demeanor had changed completely. Lisa stood still, her gun raised. "You think we're just going to walk away now?" Harris's lips curled into a cold smile. "No. But you don't have a choice." The finality of his words was like a punch in the gut, but just as the situation seemed hopeless, the sound of sirens suddenly pierced the air. The wail grew louder, and James's eyes widened as he saw the flashing lights of police cars speeding toward them from the distance. The unexpected twist left everyone momentarily paralyzed. Were these new arrivals on their side? Or were they just more part of the trap? As the sirens grew louder, Detective Harris cursed under his breath, glancing around. For the first time, uncertainty flashed in his eyes. The calm, calculated demeanor he had shown earlier cracked, and in that brief moment, it was clear that even he didn't know what was coming next. James and Sarah stood frozen, uncertain if the new arrival would bring salvation or yet another betrayal. The night was far from over, and as the police cars screeched to a halt, they realized one thing for certain: the real battle was only just beginning. The police cars skidded to a halt just yards away, their headlights blinding and cutting through the night like a beacon of hope, or a new threat. James's heart raced as he glanced from the approaching officers to Harris, whose expression had shifted from cold confidence to something resembling panic. The standoff had become even more unpredictable, and every second felt like an eternity. "Stay still," one of the officers shouted, stepping out of the car, his hand on his gun as he surveyed the situation. James couldn't make out his face in the darkness, but he could hear the tension in his voice. The officer's gaze flicked between Harris, Lisa, and the others, clearly unsure who to trust. Harris's eyes darted back and forth as if calculating his next move, but his composure was beginning to crack. "This isn't what you think," he called out to the new officers, raising his hands slightly, though his grip on the gun remained steady. They're involved in something much bigger, something dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. The officer's eyes narrowed. Don't make me tell you again, Harris. Drop the weapon. Now. But before Harris could react, another voice rang out from behind him. Hold your fire. The commanding voice was authoritative and sharp, and as it cut through the tension, everyone turned in surprise to see a tall, distinguished man emerging from the shadows. The man was older, wearing a suit and tie that seemed out of place in the middle of the night, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. His demeanor was calm, but his gaze was piercing, as if he saw through all the lies and games being played. James's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man immediately. It was Captain Ronald Gray, the same retired veteran captain whose wife, Sarah, had been wrongfully arrested only hours earlier. The man they had thought was out of the game was now standing in front of them, his face grim, his eyes reflecting something much deeper than mere authority. Captain Gray, James whispered, his voice barely audible in the sudden quiet. What the hell is going on? Gray's gaze flicked briefly to James before he spoke, his voice measured but unwavering. This isn't a game, son. It's a war, a silent war that's been waged for years. But it's about to end tonight. The revelation hit them hard. The pieces were falling into place. Captain Gray wasn't just a retired officer. He was a key player in a much larger battle, one that involved the very officers who had wrongfully arrested Sarah. The realization sunk in, the corruption was not just on the streets, it had its roots deep within the system, tangled in a web of deceit, power, and influence. Harris, visibly shaken, took a step back. You're too late, he spat, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. I've already made my move. You think you can stop this? It's over. Captain Gray's eyes flicked to Lisa, who stood with her gun still raised. His gaze softened ever so slightly, and for a moment, it seemed as though he wasn't just facing a battle but also a painful choice. I know what you've been doing, Lisa, he said quietly, his voice almost regretful. But this isn't the way. Lisa didn't lower her weapon, but her expression faltered for a brief moment. I didn't have a choice, Captain. You don't know what they've done. How deep it goes. You think it's over, but they're everywhere. Captain Gray's expression hardened. I don't have time for this. We need to move, now. Harris is just a pawn in a much bigger game. He's been compromised, and you all are in danger. Before anyone could react, the first officer from the police cars stepped forward, his weapon raised. Sir, we need to take control of the situation. You need to step back. Gray didn't flinch. No. You need to listen. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. The officers hesitated, unsure what to do, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. James could feel the weight of the choices ahead. One wrong move, and this could spiral into chaos. Then, without warning, the silence shattered as the sound of a helicopter's rotors echoed in the distance. It was growing louder, closer. The light from the chopper swept over the clearing, cutting through the trees, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped turning. Everyone looked up, and it was clear that this wasn't a random helicopter, it was coming in fast, circling the area like a predator stalking its prey. Captain Gray's face tightened as he turned his attention to the sky. They found us, he said, his voice low and grim. We don't have much time. The helicopter hovered above them, its spotlight now trained directly on the group. The officers raised their guns, aiming at the hovering craft, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be resolved with gunfire. A rope ladder was lowered, and within moments, two dark figures descended, landing gracefully on the ground. The figures were clad in black, their faces obscured by tactical gear, and their movements were swift, coordinated, precise. Captain Gray, one of the figures said in a deep, calm voice, his eyes scanning the scene. We've been ordered to extract you. The mission is compromised. You need to come with us, now. James's head spun as he tried to process the turn of events. Everything was happening so fast. One moment, they were fighting for their lives against corrupt cops. and the next, they were standing in the crosshairs of a larger, more powerful force. These new arrivals weren't ordinary law enforcement. They were military, or something far beyond that. "Who are you?" Lisa demanded, her gun still trained on the new arrivals. "What's going on?" The soldier remained unfazed. "We're not here to fight you. We're here to end this. Captain Gray, your time in the shadows is over." Captain Gray's eyes locked with the soldier's, his jaw set. "Let's finish this." Without another word, the group moved swiftly. Gray led them toward the edge of the clearing, and the helicopter's rotors spun faster, ready to lift them out of the danger zone. James and Sarah exchanged one last glance, the gravity of the situation now fully settling in. They had just become part of a much bigger story, one they hadn't even begun to understand. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, the sounds of the chaos below began to fade. The night sky opened up before them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were airborne, leaving the madness behind. But even as they soared higher, James knew this was far from over. The truth, the fight for justice, and the fight for survival, everything had just shifted into an entirely new game. And the players were more powerful than he could have ever imagined. And somewhere in the distance, they could still hear the faint sound of sirens, growing quieter as they ascended higher into the night. The helicopter cut through the dark sky, its powerful rotors thrumming in the quiet night. James and Sarah sat in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend the series of events that had just unfolded. Below them, the lights of the town were receding, but the gravity of the situation was far from fading. They were no longer just running from corrupt officers, they were now part of something far bigger, and far more dangerous. The two soldiers sat across from them, still keeping their distance, their expressions hidden behind their tactical masks. They didn't speak, but their presence was commanding, filling the cabin with a heavy tension. Captain Gray, however, didn't sit with them. Instead, he stood near the open side of the helicopter, staring out into the night, his face unreadable. Lisa leaned in close to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about you two. You need to understand that. We're all tangled up in something that's much bigger than us. Bigger than the cops, bigger than anything we ever thought we were fighting for." James could feel Sarah's hand tightening around his. She was just as confused, just as lost in the whirlwind of this twisted reality. "But who are they?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Who are those people you were talking to on the ground? What does it all mean?" Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to find the right words. "The men you saw on the ground are part of a clandestine operation. They're military, but not like you're thinking. They're part of a specialized division, trained for covert operations, people who deal with threats you'll never see coming. And Captain Gray? He's been part of this for a long time. More than you can imagine." The weight of her words hit James hard. He thought of the captain, of the man he had once looked up to as a hero, someone who had fought for his country, someone whose life should have been peaceful in retirement. But it was clear now that Gray wasn't done with his fight. He was caught in something he couldn't walk away from, no matter how much he wanted to. Lisa continued, her voice low and filled with a strange mix of regret and resolve. "The reason they came for Sarah, why she was arrested and dragged into this mess, isn't just because of some mistake. There's a far deeper reason. You see, Sarah's family has been tied up in something much more dangerous than you realize. I can't go into details now, but trust me, it's bigger than just a random wrongful arrest. Sarah is a part of something, and I'm not sure if she even knows it yet." James's mind reeled as he processed her words. Sarah? Part of something dangerous? He looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she knew what Lisa was talking about, but all he saw was confusion, just as he felt himself. "Are you saying that everything that happened to me, to us, wasn't an accident?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Lisa nodded solemnly. "No. It's all connected. It has to be. And now that we're all in the middle of it, there's no turning back. The people after you, after Gray, they don't stop. They have resources, influence, and they will hunt us until the very end. the helicopter began to bank, turning sharply as it moved toward a new destination. The change in altitude made James's stomach lurch, but his mind was far too clouded with thoughts to focus on the sensation. He was struggling to piece together the scattered clues, but it was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He turned to Sarah, who was staring out the window now, her face pale. She hadn't spoken since the conversation started, but her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He wanted to comfort her, but the truth was, he didn't know how to. They were both lost in a web of confusion and danger, with no clear path forward. Captain Gray's voice broke through the silence, his tone commanding. "We're heading to a secure location. From here, things get serious. We don't have time for questions, but I'll answer them when we're safe. For now, you need to prepare yourselves. Everything you think you know is about to be turned upside down." James nodded, feeling the weight of the captain's words settle heavily on his chest. Whatever lay ahead, it wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be the hardest fight of their lives. As the helicopter soared higher into the night, something began to feel different. James couldn't put his finger on it, but the air inside the cabin felt charged, like something big was about to happen. He glanced at Lisa, whose gaze was locked on Gray, but there was something in her eyes that hinted at deeper knowledge. She knew more than she had told them, and though she was trying to protect them, the truth was something much more terrifying than they could have imagined. The helicopter's descent began to slow, and ahead, James saw a darkened compound come into view. It was isolated, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. It looked like something straight out of a military thriller, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This was no ordinary place, it was a fortress, and they were about to enter the heart of whatever secret operation had ensnared them all. As the helicopter touched down with a soft thud, Gray moved quickly to the door, the soldiers following suit. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "We'll go in together." James and Sarah climbed out of the helicopter, their eyes scanning the area. The compound was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional bark of a guard's orders in the distance. Lisa stayed close, her eyes darting around, her nerves palpable. Gray led them through a set of steel doors into a secure building. The inside was sterile, almost clinical, with white walls and harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed above them. They moved swiftly down a corridor, their footsteps echoing in the silence, until they arrived at a heavy door with a security panel. "Get ready," Gray muttered as he keyed in a code. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a large room that looked more like a command center than anything else. Dozens of monitors lined the walls, showing various feeds from across the city, including shots of places James recognized, his own home, the streets he walked every day. They were watching them. Watching all of them. Gray turned to them, his face set in a hard line. "This is it," he said. "The people behind all of this are watching us. And if we don't act fast, they will make sure we never get out of here alive." The gravity of his words sank in. The fight was only beginning, and now, the battle for survival was no longer just about them, it was about uncovering the truth, facing down the power that had controlled everything, and finding a way to expose the lies before it was too late. And somewhere, in the shadows, their enemies were waiting. The room fell into a tense silence as Captain Gray's words hung in the air. The stakes were higher than ever, and everyone in the room understood that their next move could mean life or death. James and Sarah exchanged a glance, the realization finally hitting them that they were no longer mere victims of a police conspiracy, they were now part of something much more dangerous, much more intricate than they could have ever imagined. Gray moved swiftly to one of the monitors and began typing commands, his eyes scanning the information on the screen. "These people, whoever they are, have been manipulating events from the shadows for years," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But tonight, we're going to turn the tables." Lisa stood behind him, her face set with determination. "It's time to expose them. We've been running from them long enough." As the data loaded on the screen, it became clear just how far-reaching this conspiracy went. James saw images of politicians, business leaders, and even high-ranking law enforcement officers, people who had been in positions of power and influence, all connected to a network of corruption. The shocking realization hit him harder than he had expected. This wasn't just about racial injustice or a single wrongful arrest. This was about a deeply rooted system, one that controlled the strings of society and silenced those who threatened it. They've used their power to frame people, ruin lives, and cover up the truth, Gray continued, his tone laced with bitterness. But no more. We're going to take them down, starting with the key players. James felt the weight of responsibility settling on him. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by this system, everyone who had been forced to live in the shadow of lies and corruption. It was bigger than he could have ever imagined, and now, he was in the heart of the storm. Suddenly, the doors to the room burst open, and a team of armed soldiers filed in, their expressions grim. They were here for one reason only, to ensure the mission succeeded. The tension in the room thickened, and James could feel the intensity of the moment. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice, for truth. Everything's in place, one of the soldiers said, nodding to Gray. We're ready to move. Captain Gray turned to James and Sarah, his eyes locking with theirs. This is it. You've been a part of something bigger than you realize, and now, you have a choice. You can walk away, and we'll take care of the rest, or you can stay and help us finish what we started. James looked at Sarah, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw the fire in her eyes. She wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been dragged through the mud by a corrupt system. She was a warrior now, standing alongside him, ready to fight for a better world. We're in, Sarah said, her voice steady. Let's finish this. With that, Captain Gray led them through the corridors, out of the command center, and into the heart of the operation. The soldiers moved with precision, securing every exit, ensuring that no one would stand in their way. As they approached the final room, the air grew thick with anticipation. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, was coming down to this moment. Gray turned to face the group. Once we breach this room, there's no turning back. These people won't go down without a fight. Be ready for anything. James's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew this was it. They had come too far to back down now. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, about ensuring that those who had been wronged would have their day in court, their moment to stand tall and demand the truth. The doors to the final room swung open, and a wave of shock washed over them. Inside, sitting at a large table, were the very people who had been orchestrating the chaos, the ones who had manipulated events, controlled the media, and framed innocent people for their own gain. There were politicians, law enforcement officers, business tycoons, and even a few familiar faces from the town. Their expressions ranged from smug superiority to outright shock as they realized what was happening. You're too late, one of the men sneered, standing up from his chair. You can't stop this. We're too powerful. Gray stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. It's over, he said, his voice cold. You've had your reign, but now, it ends. We're taking you down. The soldiers moved quickly, surrounding the table, their weapons drawn. The people in the room froze, realizing they had no escape. This wasn't the scenario they had anticipated. They thought they could control everything, manipulate everyone, but they had underestimated the resolve of those who had been wronged, the people who were willing to fight for the truth. As the soldiers began cuffing the criminals, James and Sarah stood in the back, watching it all unfold. It was surreal. The powerful men and women who had thought they were untouchable were now being led away in handcuffs, their faces drained of color, their arrogance shattered. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. This wasn't about winning, it was about setting things right. As the last of the conspirators were taken into custody, Captain Gray turned to James and Sarah. You did it, he said, a hint of pride in his voice. You helped bring this down. You've shown that the truth will always come out, no matter how deep the lies run. James felt a mix of emotions flood through him, relief, exhaustion, and a sense of justice finally being served. But most of all, he felt hope. Hope for a better future, one where corruption no longer reigned supreme, one where people like Sarah, like him, would no longer be silenced by the system. As they left the compound, the first light of dawn began to break through the sky. It was a new day, and though there was still work to be done, there was a sense of peace in the air. The fight wasn't over, but it had taken a decisive turn. The truth had won, and for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. And as James looked at Sarah, her hand in his, he knew one thing for sure: no matter what came next, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, stronger than ever. The world was changing, and they were part of that change. Their story was just beginning.